I had been going to Dr. Elliot Sterling for over 20 years. He'd seen me through everything. My late husband's cancer, my broken hip, even my yearly checkups that always ended with him teasing me about my blood pressure. "You're stronger than most women half your age, Martha," he'd say. But that Tuesday morning, something was different. The office smelled the same, antiseptic and coffee, but the air felt heavy. Dr. Sterling's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. He avoided eye contact while listening to my heartbeat, and his usual smile was nowhere to be found. "Everything looks good," he said quietly. "Your heart is strong. Lungs sound fine. Nothing to worry about." But his voice sounded like someone forcing calm while standing on the edge of a cliff. As I reached for my purse, he leaned in closer than he ever had before. "Martha," he whispered, his tone just above a breath, "take care of yourself, and remember, family isn't always what it seems." Before I could ask what he meant, he slipped something into the side pocket of my bag. A folded piece of paper. I frowned. "Doctor?" But he only forced a smile and said louder this time, "You're all set, Mrs. Caldwell. Have a good day." His nurse came in right after, holding my chart, and the conversation was over. I left the office, confused, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. Outside, the wind felt colder than usual. I hailed a cab and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe he'd just had a bad morning. Maybe it was nothing. But as the taxi rolled through the streets, something inside me refused to relax. My mind kept replaying his words. Family isn't always what it seems. When I finally got home, my son Benjamin was in the living room. His wife, Eleanor, was beside him, flipping through papers. My granddaughter Olivia sat on the couch, scrolling her phone, looking bored. They all stopped talking when they saw me. Too quickly. "Mom," Benjamin said, smiling that rehearsed smile I'd started to notice more and more lately. "How was your appointment?" "Fine," I said, forcing my own smile. "Doctor says I'm as healthy as ever." I noticed Eleanor glance at Benjamin, her lips tightening, almost disappointed. That evening, the tension in the house was unbearable. Benjamin barely spoke. Eleanor avoided eye contact. Even Olivia's usual chatter was gone. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room and finally remembered the note. My hands trembled as I opened my purse and pulled out the folded piece of paper. Inside, in Dr. Sterling's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words that made my stomach drop. "Don't go home. Run now." I read it again. And again. Was this some kind of joke? Why would he write that? My mind raced back to his strange behavior, his warning, the fear in his eyes. And then I remembered Eleanor's glance, the papers she tried to hide when I came in. A cold wave ran down my spine. That night, I barely slept. Every time the floor creaked, I flinched. Every whisper from the hallway made my heart race. I told myself it was paranoia, old age playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. At 2 a.m., I heard voices. Low, sharp, coming from the kitchen. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the stove light. As I approached the door, I froze. I heard Eleanor's voice. "The damn doctor wouldn't cooperate. I told him she's losing her mind, but he said she's perfectly fine." Benjamin's reply was calm, almost cold. "Relax. We'll find another doctor. There's always someone willing to sign the papers for the right price." Papers? My breath caught in my throat. And what if she finds out? Eleanor hissed. She won't. She's too trusting. We'll have her declared incompetent in a week. Then we get the house, her pension, everything. My knees nearly gave out. My son, my only son. Olivia's voice cut in, carefree, cruel. Good, I need that money for college anyway. Grandma's lived long enough. Their laughter filled the kitchen like poison. That was the moment I realized the doctor's note wasn't madness. It was mercy. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside my window. The kind of peaceful illusion that makes you believe everything is fine. But once you've overheard your own family plotting to destroy you, peace becomes just another kind of noise. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the doctor's note. The paper was wrinkled now, the ink slightly smudged from my trembling hands. Don't go home. Run now. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was proof. Proof that someone else had seen what I refused to believe. My son, his wife, my own granddaughter, they were after me. I had no one left to trust. My husband had passed 6 years ago, and my friends were scattered across states, their lives too far away to reach into mine. For 70 years, I'd prided myself on being independent, strong, capable. But that morning I felt small, like prey. Benjamin knocked gently on my door around 8. Mom, you awake? I hid the note under my pillow. Yes, dear. He poked his head in, wearing that same careful smile, the kind you use on someone you've already betrayed. I thought we could have breakfast together. Eleanor made pancakes. Pancakes. My favorite. My late husband used to make them for me every Sunday. Now I couldn't look at them without tasting betrayal. At the table, Eleanor poured syrup and said softly, You're awfully quiet, Martha. Everything okay? I wanted to scream, to flip the plate and show them I knew everything. But instead, I smiled. I'm fine, dear. Just tired. Didn't sleep well. Benjamin exchanged a look with her, a silent conversation I'd seen 100 times before. They thought I was slipping, losing it. Perfect. Let them think that. Because if I was going to survive, I needed to play their game. That afternoon, while Eleanor and Olivia went shopping, I told Benjamin I was going to take a nap. Instead, I quietly packed a few things. Cash from my sewing drawer, my birth certificate, the deed to the house that was still in my name, and a tiny voice recorder I'd found in the drawer of my late husband's desk. He'd used it to record his lectures back when he taught history at the community college. I never thought I'd need it to record a crime. I tucked it in my cardigan pocket and waited. When Eleanor and Olivia returned, their laughter filled the hallway. Bags rustled, doors opened, and soon they were all in the kitchen again. I walked in casually, pretending to look for my glasses. Then I pressed record. It didn't take long. Eleanor's voice came first. I called the lawyer. He said once the medical declaration is signed, we can petition for guardianship. After that, we'll sell the property. Benjamin replied, She won't know a thing. She thinks Dr. Sterling's still her friend. By the time she realizes what's happening, she will be in assisted living. Olivia laughed. I'm serious, Dad. If we sell the house, can I get the Jeep I wanted? Sure, sweetheart, once Grandma's paperwork is done. My stomach turned. I kept smiling, and my thumb stayed on the recorder. That night, I called Dr. Sterling from the small phone I kept in my knitting basket, an old one no one knew I still used. He answered on the second ring, voice shaking. Martha, thank God I was worried sick. You got my note. Yes, I whispered. You were right. They're planning to have me declared incompetent. He exhaled heavily. Martha, listen to me carefully. They came to my office last week asking me to sign false reports. When I refused, they threatened to ruin my career. I couldn't tell you in front of them. They had someone watching the clinic. I had to warn you somehow. Tears burned my eyes. What do I do? He hesitated. You need to leave that house tonight. I can help, but you must trust me. Leaving was the hardest thing I had ever done. Not because of what I was leaving behind, but because of what I'd built there. Every memory with my husband, every birthday, every laugh, every tear shed in that home. All of it turned into poison the moment my own blood decided I was worth more alive than dead. At 3 a.m., I packed a small suitcase, just essentials, clothes, my medicine, the recorder, and the note. I took one last look around my room. Then, as quietly as I could, I slipped out the back door. The night air was sharp, cold. I walked 2 blocks before calling a cab. As we drove away, I looked back through the rear window at the only home I'd ever known, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Inside that house were people who carried my name, my love, my trust, and had turned it all into a weapon. I didn't cry. Not yet. Revenge was a colder thing than tears could touch. Dr. Sterling met me at a small motel on the edge of town. His hair looked grayer than I remembered, his face drawn with guilt. Martha, he said softly, I've arranged something. A friend of mine is an attorney. Honest, discreet. We'll take your statement and those recordings. You can fight this. I handed him the recorder. Doctor, I'm not running forever. He frowned. What do you mean? I'm not just going to protect myself. I'm going to destroy them. He blinked. Martha, revenge isn't. I interrupted, my voice steady. They wanted to bury me alive in paperwork. They wanted to make me disappear. I won't just survive this. I will make them regret underestimating me. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You were always stronger than you looked, he said quietly. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the sky, pale gold against the dark horizon. I watched it through the motel window, gripping the doctor's note tightly in my hand. They thought I was weak. They thought age made me blind. They forgot one thing. I raised them. I taught them every trick they're using against me. Now it was my turn to teach them something new. How it feels when a mother stops forgiving. When you are underestimated for decades, people forget how carefully you learned the world's angles. I had spent a lifetime balancing budgets, reading the fine print of contracts my husband brought home, signing school forms, teaching Benjamin how to write a polite note. Those quiet, ordinary skills became my weapons. Dr. Sterling introduced me to his friend the next morning, a man with steady hands and a way of speaking that made complicated things sound simple. Graham Montgomery, he said. You need someone who will think 3 steps ahead. His card was crisp, the kind of card lawyers use when they don't need to sell themselves. Graham asked me only one question the first time we met. How much do you want them to suffer? I looked at him, and I did not mean cruelty. I meant justice. Everything, I said, but legally. Make it clean, make it public, make them remember. He smiled once approvingly and set his team in motion. Step 1. Evidence. Graham hired a private investigator named Lewis. Small, wiry, relentless. Lewis moved like a quiet storm. Within days, he produced bank records, email trails, and surveillance footage. Credit card applications taken out in my name, fraudulent calls to insurers, a pattern of incremental theft, small charges first, dinners, clothes, then bolder moves, hush money to a medical consultant, offers of cash to a second doctor, a phone call to an attorney pressuring for guardianship paperwork. All of it pointed in one direction: Benjamin and Eleanor. Step 2, the trap. We needed them to move. We needed them to make the next mistake in a place where the law could catch them in the act. Graham's idea was surgical. We created a controlled liability. A fake attorney named Hawthorne and Pierce emailed them an offer, an expedited guardianship packet for Mrs. Caldwell, drawn up and ready to sign. It looked real: official letterhead, a notarized-looking signature, and a clause that said, immediate transfer of discretionary funds to the guardian upon approval. We never meant to let them take money, but we needed them to try. Graham's office forwarded the packet directly to Eleanor's hidden email address, the one Lewis had found buried under her shopping receipts. Then Graham arranged for a notary to be on standby at a neutral location, local, legitimate, but ready to stop things if they stepped over legal lines. Meanwhile, I returned home, not as a frail old woman desperate to be kept, but as a matriarch with a plan. I walked in carrying groceries and the same old apron. I let Benjamin wrap me in that practiced hug he used on anniversaries. I made coffee and reminded Olivia about calculus homework. I laughed at Eleanor's attempts to talk about renovations. Everything I did was to make them comfortable to do what they were going to do. They fell into the trap like fish. Eleanor was the first to respond, eager fingers and impatient tone. She said she could have everything done by Friday on the phone, voice low so I could hear none of it. She emailed Hawthorne and Pierce back asking about transfer protocols. She printed the packet and left it on the kitchen table, the seal cracked open like a mouth waiting to swallow. Benjamin came home late one night with a man I did not know. The man pretended to be calm and helpful. He offered to handle the legalities. I pretended I did not notice the cash exchange, the folded envelopes, and the whispered phone numbers. I let them feel brave. Step 3. The confrontation that wasn't a confrontation. Graham's team moved quietly. On the morning they planned to finalize everything at a bank branch downtown, we had a forensic accountant and 2 officers from the Elder Protection Unit waiting. Lewis had uncovered a web of purchases and transfers tied to Eleanor's cards and a shell company she'd set up with a friend. It was all there: receipts, invoices, and a trail that led to the Jeep Olivia had been bragging about. When Benjamin and Eleanor walked into the bank that morning, confident and smug, they thought they were meeting an attorney. Instead, they were met with a small swarm of professionals and a camera crew Graham had discreetly invited, not for tabloids, but to document the legal process in real time. The officers read them their rights in a low, polite voice that echoed in my ears like a chorus. "We have reason to believe you have engaged in elder financial exploitation," one officer said. Their faces changed in one terrible, immediate heartbeat, from certainty to the pale, raw panic of people who suddenly realize they bet on the wrong hand. Olivia arrived later, breathless and frightened when she saw them led to the bank's small interview room. Her first reaction was outrage. "You're ruining my life!" Then a terrible, guilty silence when the evidence was laid bare. The Jeep's payment records, the jewelry invoices, the hotel charges in Florida that matched dates when I had supposedly been home. The private investigator's voice recordings, my recorder's low, steady proof of their plotting, played embarrassingly, incontrovertibly in the background. There was no room for performance now. The recorder caught them plotting the plan to declare me incompetent the night I heard them in the kitchen. It was a line, a legal red thread leading from their conspiratorial whispers straight to their hands. Step 4. The legal net tightens. Graham's office filed a criminal complaint that afternoon. Charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted exploitation of an elder. We filed civil petitions simultaneously, an injunction preventing any access to my financial accounts, and a petition for protective oversight. My deed remains safe in a trust Graham had quickly set up for me the week before. He called it a, quote, emergency protective trust, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm that wasn't fear-driven. But justice, even when swift, has teeth that take time to sink in. The community where we lived was small and tight-knit. Word spread that morning like brush fire. Neighbors came to my door in disbelief. The ones I thought I'd lost contact with, old school friends, the woman down the street who brought me soup when I was ill, they came with casseroles and coffees, and the hard, steady looks of people who now knew the truth. It was a balm to my bruised heart. Step 5. The lesson. I did not want mere punishment. I wanted exposure. Not because I savored humiliation, but because secrecy had been their ally for so long. So Graham organized a press statement, a careful, legally sound briefing that laid out what elder financial exploitation could look like and how common it was, without naming specifics in a way that risked jeopardizing indictments. The local paper ran it the next day, a sober, damning column about families who crossed moral lines for money. I watched the printouts with a private satisfaction, the words like small, clean knives, cutting through the cover they'd wrapped themselves in. At home, the air had shifted into something I barely recognized. Benjamin did not speak to me for 3 days. Eleanor left the house as if it had become an oven she could not bear to step into. Olivia, who had once been bright and defiant, sat in the corner and clutched her phone like a lifeline, her eyes red from crying. Graham told me to be careful. He warned me, they'll try to intimidate you. They may go for custody manipulations, sympathetic stories, even claims you're unstable. He was right. They tried. Their friends and a few enablers told small lies at first, that I'd always been forgetful, that I'd made a scene, that my callousness had driven them to desperation. But the recorder, the bank records, the paper trail, they were immune to sympathy. There was one moment, late at night, when Benjamin stood at my bedroom door. He was a small man then, not physically, but a man reduced by the weight of what he'd done. "Mom," he said, voice raw, "please, we can work this out. I never wanted—" His words trailed into a wail. I did not shout. I did not throw accusations. I walked to the sink, washed my hands slowly, and turned to him. I said, "You wanted comfort, not consequence. You wanted what you think I have without the work it takes to earn it. Remember who raised you. You know better." He broke then. Such a thing surprises you only when you realize that the child you raised is also made of ordinary clay. The case did not end in one dramatic courtroom scene. Life is rarely so neat. There were meetings, depositions, angry legal letters, and a protective judge who seemed to understand the cruelty of these cases. But the seeds of their ruin had been sown. They had taken the bait, and the law, slow and stubborn as it can be, began to collect them like evidence in a moth trap. Outside, life continued. The sky still found ways to be blue. The coffee still smelled like comfort. I found myself walking the same familiar streets, feeling the same familiar sun on my face, but with a new core of resolve. Revenge, I was learning, was not only about the moment of exposure. It was about the careful, surgical dismantling of the lie that had been built around me. It was about making them sit in the rubble of their choices and tally up the cost. I kept the recorder turned off now. Proof had been established, tools had been used, but there were more pieces to move, a final act I had saved for myself. A lesson that would not be hurried and which would be delivered with a mother's quiet precision. The morning the story went public, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table like a woman waiting for mail that never comes. I didn't tremble. I simply watched the steam rise from my cup and took the first brave sip. Outside, neighbors walked dogs and mowed lawns, the small rituals of a town that believed in ordinary days. Inside, the ordinary had fractured into 1,000 tiny edges. Graham called early. "We're ready to go public," he said. Not in a sensational way, a measured release. The paper will run the facts and we'll hold a press briefing. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. His voice was steady. He always sounded steadier than the weather. But I did want to speak. I wanted not to perform triumph, but to remind people what the word family should mean. I wanted to say that betrayal isn't a romantic plot device. It's a slow theft that erases years of trust. At the press briefing, Graham stood at the podium with the Attorney General's elder protection liaison beside him. Cameras flashed, pens scratched, and the courthouse steps smelled faintly of lemon polish and old stone. I stood at the back, my cardigan buttoned, a small brooch pinned to the lapel, my late husband's gift on our 25th anniversary. It felt like armor. Graham spoke first, carefully. He described the case in clear, unemotional language. The discovery of fraudulent credit activity, the recorded conspiracy, the attempted guardianship scheme. He explained elder financial exploitation and stressed that these crimes often happen behind closed doors, behind smiles and "we're taking care of you" lines. Then he turned and said my name. "Martha Caldwell has entrusted us with the truth," he said. "She has done more than survive. She has chosen to stand up. We owe her and others like her our full attention." I walked to the microphone slowly. The light hit the silver of my hair, and for a second I felt like a woman on the edge of a cliff looking at the valley below, not afraid of falling, but curious what the wind felt like. "My name is Martha Caldwell," I said, voice a little rough. "I raised a son, I loved a husband, and I believed family would always protect me. When I learned that my son and his wife planned to take everything I have, I had two choices: hide or fight. I chose to fight. Not because I wanted revenge for revenge's sake, but because silence would have cost me my dignity. And I stopped because the words wouldn't hold the salt behind my eyes. I gathered myself, then continued. No one should have to watch their family plot their erasure. If my story helps one other elder find their voice, it will be worth every lonely night. The crowd murmured. Cameras whirred. I stepped down and felt briefly the solid comfort I had felt years before when I taught my son to tie his shoes. Then it was over. Interviews with local reporters, a tidy statement released to television news, and a version of the truth that would live in clips and headlines for a while. Afterwards, neighbors knocked. They brought casseroles, wrote letters, and admitted quietly that they had suspected something but didn't want to pry. The pastor from the church where we had married called and offered to sit with me whenever I needed. The community, bruised and embarrassed, rallied not because scandal is entertaining, but because a wrong had been revealed in their midst. But the exposure did more than rally the good. It pulled the wolves out of their dens. Old acquaintances of my son who had once smiled at holiday parties now avoided my street. People who were willing to take tiny, dishonest favors had an uncomfortable distance in their eyes. Benjamin and Eleanor tried for a while to step into the role of contrition, apologizing to anyone who would listen, begging for privacy, promising to make amends. But the recording, the bank statements, the notary's report, all created a weight they could not easily lift. There was a particular cruelty to seeing them reduced, not because I rejoiced, but because the scale of their moral collapse was larger than any of us anticipated. I had loved a man who raised his son to be kind. Then I had watched that boy make a life of compromises, small and large. To see the entire edifice crumble reminded me that people are not one thing. They're choices stacked like cards, and sometimes those cards topple. One evening, weeks into the legal process, a local talk show host asked if I would join a segment on elder abuse. I declined politely. The cameras could do what they needed. I had a different stage in mind. My final act of exposure would not be performed in public lights. It would be quieter. It would be a careful return of what had been taken. Not just property, but the truth. I wanted my son to taste the exact hollow of his choices. Graham and I spent long afternoons strategizing. He recommended restraint. "Martha," he said once, "the law will take care of much, but you ask me for a clean public lesson. If you want them humiliated in a way that changes them, we have to be surgical." His eyes held a rare softness. This was not cruelty, but justice measured and precise. We began with the trust we had set up. Rather than place the assets under entirely private control, Graham suggested a conditional strategy. The funds would be held in a trust with strict disbursement clauses that required beneficiaries not only to avoid criminal activity, but to perform community restitution should they ever touch those funds unjustly. He also suggested a restorative clause. Beneficiaries must complete community service at the elder shelter I had once helped run. Not punitive theater, but a slow, hands-on learning experience to rebuild empathy. It was a small thing, perhaps, but sometimes small things change people. We drafted clauses that read like moral mirrors. Before receiving any disbursements, beneficiaries must undergo financial ethics counseling, provide proof of financial independence, and complete a minimum of 6 months of supervised community service at the Hale Community Shelter. The trust would be overseen by an independent board made up of community leaders, not family. It was, in effect, a contract that required them to work with people they had discounted. When the trust document was finally read to Benjamin and Eleanor in a cold, formal room by a neutral trustee, the color drained from Benjamin's face. "You think forcing us to work in a soup kitchen will teach us anything?" he asked, incredulously. Eleanor scoffed, then grew quiet when the trustee explained that community restitution was not symbolic. It was a legal requirement tied to their ability to ever access funds. "You can't do this," Benjamin said, voice thinner than I expected. "You can't make our lives like this." He sounded small, scared. That fear was the first visible crack in his armor. "We can," Graham said quietly. "This trust is within the law. It protects Mrs. Caldwell's assets from further exploitation while offering a path to redemption. It protects her legacy and gives the community a chance to heal." They had options. Fight, which would mean years in court with legal bills that would eat their pockets and reputations, or accept, which would force them to do the hard work in front of the people they tried to deceive. For the first time, the future had more than one route to it, and not all routes favored their ease. They chose the public path, bitter and grumbling, yet constrained by the legal scaffolding we had erected. The town watched. Some neighbors hesitated and stayed away. Others, who knew me and my history of kindness, volunteered to supervise. There was humiliation, yes, but there was also the possibility of repair. The twist I had planned was not just punishment. It was an engineered opportunity for change. In the months that followed, I watched them at the shelter. Eleanor struggled at first, folding blankets awkwardly, squinting at donation ledgers. Benjamin moved among the tables with a stiff, nervous energy, reciting reheated lines of apology that felt foreign in his mouth. Olivia, young and unsettled, wanted privacy, but arrived anyway, her hands trembling when she handed out plates. The community watched their faces change in small increments. Sometimes the lessons were petty. Eleanor learned how to value a volunteer's time. Benjamin learned to listen without interrupting. Other lessons were deeper. The shame of seeing someone you wronged smile without reservation because the food you've helped serve simply fed them. The trust forced them not into a spectacle, but into the mundane labor that strips entitlement clean. And slowly, not fully, but enough that the shape of it was visible, they began to shift. Not because I demanded it, but because the work forced proximity to the human cost of their choices. My revenge had a quiet face, a requirement to confront their own reflections in the eyes of people they had once seen as lesser. Throughout this, I kept a small routine. Morning walks, a cup of coffee at the diner where, occasionally, people still eyed me with caution, and weekly visits to the shelter where I watched beneficiaries pick at the warm soup I had made years ago. I did not gloat. I did not rub salt into wounds. The point had never been to savor humiliation. It was to remove the cover and let light do its slow work. At night, when the house was my own again, I read old letters from my husband and wrote notes to myself, reminders for future days, or perhaps to the woman I'd been before the betrayal. I found in those letters a line he had once written about strength being the quiet habit of the brave. I pinned it to my fridge like a talisman. Friends told me I had been merciful to allow them a path. Others thought I had been too soft. But mercy, I decided, was not appeasement. It was the chance for rectification. If they refused the chance, the law would take its course. If they accepted, perhaps their children and the community would see something redeemed. Justice, I learned, is often a slow work. Exposure had been only the first hammer blow. Now the rebuilding began, and it required more patience than I'd first imagined. The word reckoning sounds grand, like the final bell in an opera. But the truth is that reckoning is often a quiet, grinding thing. It arrives slowly, in paperwork and court dates, in the small humiliations that add up like taxicab meters. It is the sound of a life recalculated. After the trust and the community service mandate, the legal wheels began to churn in ways that felt both cruel and cleansing. Graham's criminal complaints blossomed into a formal investigation. The district attorney assigned a prosecutor who had made a name for herself in elder protection cases. She was a lean woman with quick eyes and a voice that did not bother with softness. She took the case with a simple sentence: people who take advantage of the vulnerable must be held accountable. Benjamin's world narrowed. Where once he had a network of friends and people willing to lend him a second opinion and a name for bad decisions, he now had subpoenas and unanswered questions. Friends who had once found his jokes charming now found him uncomfortable. Vendors who'd accepted his cards at brunch returned their calls with formality and delay. Business acquaintances who'd once assumed he had a future now looked at his name on legal filings and made excuses. There were courtroom hearings in which technicalities were argued and depositions given. Eleanor, in particular, was hounded by the weight of the paper trail. Her credit applications in my name, signed receipts for purchases, and a forged authorization form for one of my checkbooks were presented in clear, clinical order. She sat in the gallery with her arms folded, the kind of posture people use when they hope to contain shame. Olivia, young and raw, watched from the back row. In private, she cried often, apologizing in fits and starts to me in voicemail messages she left at all hours, her voice thick with teenage regret. I heard her messages sometimes and left them unread for a day, then played them and sighed at the awkwardness of her remorse. There was sincerity there, perhaps, tangled with the naivete of a life barely begun, and the brutal lessons of privilege shown to have been conditional. The prosecutors had evidence enough to pursue charges, but law is not instant. It moves like a tide, inevitable, but patient. While legal strategy developed, the social consequences were immediate and painful. Graham's job at the logistics company, one he had been at for nearly a decade, became a question mark. There were quiet meetings at HR. A decision that once would have been a mere appraisal now had the weight of public scandal. He was suspended pending an internal review. The community's whispers followed him like a shadow. I watched these things with a complexity of feeling that surprised me. I did not savor the collapse. I had never been cruel. What I felt was a slow relief, the uncoiling of a long-held tension. There were nights I woke and the house felt unbearably empty, and yet within that emptiness, a new room of calm had opened. I would have rather had a son who had chosen differently, but I recognized that a reckoning, however painful, was sometimes the only doorway to repair. Graham, meticulous by nature, encouraged me to be measured. He said, "The law will do its work, but your role is to stay steady. Testify if needed, but do not be baited by spectacle." He sensed, I think, the kind of vengeance that eats those who serve it. He wanted my victory to be clean. And so, it was clean. In many ways. Eleanor pleaded guilty to several counts of fraud and identity theft in exchange for a reduced sentence and a mandated restitution plan. Her plea spared the family a messy trial, but the penalty was public and sharp. Fines, mandatory counseling, and community service far beyond the trust's requirements. The judge spoke directly to her in courtroom silence, a rebuke that echoed in my memory. People who take advantage of the vulnerable must be held accountable. The words landed like cold rain. Benjamin, for reasons that would unfold in slow, brittle stages, chose a different path. He fought. He hired lawyers and tried to assert that he had been coerced by Eleanor, that he had been foolish but not criminal. In deposition, his voice often cracked. He looked smaller under questioning than he had ever looked in my living room hugging me on birthdays. The prosecution countered with evidence. The recorded conversations, the bank transfers to his accounts, the Jeep invoice, and social media post where he bragged about the trip he and Eleanor had taken using money that, the record showed, belonged to me. A key moment came during one deposition, recorded and sealed by the court. The prosecutor played a clip of a dinner conversation, the one where Benjamin had admitted in a moment of careless arrogance that he didn't think it would matter because Grandma would never know. His face turned a strange, raked color as the room absorbed that line. That line carried the weight of everyday cruelty, the casual math that equates a loved one's dignity with a quick vacation. Words, in the end, are often their own witnesses. The media attention intensified. I tried to stay stoic as reporters shuffled outside my porch, eager for a quote. They were interested in a sensational headline, of course, but many of them also wanted to shed light on elder abuse, and that felt necessary. I gave an interview once, then stopped. Words can turn salt into wound if overused. Instead, I wrote op-eds with Graham's help, essays about dignity and elder rights. They were published in the local paper and then picked up by a regional outlet. People wrote back with gratitude and stories of their own. Neighbors who'd kept quiet about suspicious bank activity, daughters who'd been guilted into silence. The letters filled me with a fierce compassion and the knowledge that this was not only my fight. The legal battle produced slow, painful revelations. Friends of Benjamin testified in court under subpoena and told stories of his willingness to cut corners, small favoritism at work, a pattern of wanting more than what he had earned. Eleanor's history, too, came into focus. A girl who had grown up with little, who had built her dreams quickly, and was terrified of losing them. The courtroom became a place where private histories were exposed like old photographs, edges curling, colors faded. One afternoon, as the case dragged into its third month, I sat in the courthouse hallway with a cup of terrible coffee and watched Benjamin pass. He avoided my eye. He looked like a man who had aged in a week. He was thinner, his jaw set. He was not vindicated or balancing bravely on some moral high ground. He was simply a person who had made choices that had their costs. The reckoning did something else that surprised me. It opened conversations with Olivia. She called me one night and asked if she could meet. We arranged to meet at a small cafe away from the courthouse and the glare. She arrived with a hat pulled low, eyes rimmed with red. For a moment, she hesitated on the threshold, then moved toward me like a child approaching a teacher. "Grandma," she began, voice tentative. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I thought you wouldn't mind." She sounded like a child again, and I felt a fierce impulse to gather her. Instead, I pushed the urge into something practical. "Do you want to help at the shelter?" I asked. It was not a punishment. It was a chance. Come for a few hours, see how hard people work. See how small kindness can be. She sniffed and nodded. "I'll come. I want to. I need to," she said, and in that need I heard the fracture inside her. A bright kid who had been taught to value material things over human ones. I wanted to give her the tools to change that, if she wanted them. The reckoning kept working. It moved like weather, sometimes a storm, sometimes a calm. Lawyers sent letters, judges ruled on motions, the trust enforced its terms. Eleanor began the restitution payments, hand over hand, a humiliating arithmetic of making amends. Benjamin's charges lingered, shifting between plea negotiations and the possibility of trial. He had, despite everything, moments where he tried to be contrite, where he sat by the shelter's hot meal window and listened to veterans speak of small, hard things, the way a person cleans a wound by letting air reach it. I did not exult in their pain. I had wanted, and still wanted, something beyond revenge. I wanted repair. The law was one tool, time would be the other. There were nights when I thought about the shape of the life I'd led. I had loved and loved fiercely and been hurt in ways that felt both small and monumental. I recognized the ache of being betrayed by those you teach to live. But I also recognized the unexpected bloom of power that rose from the ashes. Not power to punish, but power to change the narrative that only the quiet voice can carry forward. As the months closed on the first year of this ordeal, some things were clear. The house remained mine, the trust protected my assets, and the community had become an unlikely shield. The law, slow but steady, had done its job in ways that felt like mercy. And yet I knew the last phase of the reckoning had not come. There was one final move I had saved, a choice that would shift the story from punishment to legacy. It was private, intimate, and measured, and it would make the lesson last in a way a courtroom never could. I had always believed that true consequences are the ones that make a person see themselves as others do. For that, public shame only works so far. The deepest learning is private and persistent. The last piece of my plan was not designed to humiliate, but to carve a path so particular and personal that it would demand engagement from those who tried to erase me. I kept the particulars close to my chest. A last letter, folded and sealed, with instructions not only for how the money would be used in the event of certain future actions, but with the names of people and institutions meant to benefit if they chose the restorative path. The letter was not a threat. It was an offer. It read like a ledger of possibility. You can choose to take this money and continue your life as it was, or you can choose the path that requires honesty, work, and courage. The money would not be a refuge for the greedy. It would be a tool for the brave. There is a mercy in offering people a chance to be better. I believed, perhaps optimistically, that some would take it. The reckoning, I realized, had two sides. One that made people pay for harm, and another that offered a bridge back to humanity. I had wanted both. After all, justice without the chance of repair is only punishment. Mercy without consequence is dereliction. I had thought, through nights of sleepless planning, that a mother could hold both scales. The final acts were close. The trial loomed like a small, necessary storm. The community watched. And I, who had once been small and obedient to the clock of others' needs, found myself holding something that felt like a quiet authority. I had found, in the long arc of this battle, a voice I had not known I possessed. When at last the moment arrived for the last part of my plan, I would speak not as a victim, but as a woman who had been wronged and had chosen the long, slow path to address it. The reckoning, I knew, does not always end in a single moment. Sometimes it is the collection of small, relentless truths that finally teach. The trial began on a gray Monday, the kind of day when even the sky looks tired, as if it knows it's about to witness something it would rather not see. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and people whispered my name as if I were both victim and villain, survivor and ghost. I walked past them slowly, my cane tapping against the marble steps. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was ready. Because revenge, when it finally comes, isn't loud. It's calm. It's the silence that follows when the truth speaks for itself. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension. Benjamin sat at the defense table, thinner now, hair graying at the edges. Eleanor sat beside him, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Between them sat Olivia, their daughter, my granddaughter, the only one who still looked like she didn't belong in this tragedy. When she caught my eye, she gave me a small, trembling nod. I nodded back. The judge entered, and the room fell into the kind of hush that only exists when a family's fate is about to be rewritten. The prosecutor began by playing the recording. My own voice filled the speakers, shaky but clear. Then Benjamin's voice. Eleanor's laughter. The words, "Once Grandma's paperwork is done," echoed through the courtroom like a curse. Benjamin shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor stared at her hands, and Olivia began to cry. The jury watched in silence as the story unfolded. My story. A 70-year-old woman's quiet battle for dignity and the betrayal that almost stole it all. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, holding the very note that had started it all. Dr. Sterling's shaky handwriting still visible. Don't go home. Run. I took a breath. My voice came out softer than I expected, but steady. I didn't run. Not forever. Because running means you're afraid. And I decided I wouldn't live afraid. Not of my own blood. Not of betrayal. Not of losing what's rightfully mine. I looked directly at Benjamin. You wanted me gone. You wanted what I built. You forgot that you can't steal strength. You either have it or you don't. The room stayed silent. You could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Then I turned to the judge. I'm not here to destroy my family, I said quietly. I'm here to make sure they learn what family really means. When the verdict came, it was like an exhale after years of holding my breath. Guilty. Fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial exploitation of an elder. Benjamin was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Eleanor received a year in a correctional facility and community service. But the judge did something unexpected, something I had quietly arranged behind the scenes. Instead of monetary restitution, I requested that the funds seized from their assets be redirected to the Martha Foundation for Elder Justice, a nonprofit I had founded quietly months before with Graham's help. Its mission was simple: to protect seniors from abuse, fraud, and neglect, the very things my family had tried to do to me. The courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. Martha, he said, that's an extraordinary request. Are you certain? I smiled. Yes, Your Honor. Let them pay forward what they took. Outside, the reporters swarmed me again. They wanted anger, fire, outrage. But all I said was, it's over. Let's talk about what comes next. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't watching someone fall. It's standing taller yourself. It's turning pain into something that helps others rise. Months passed. Seasons changed. The house, my house, became a quiet haven again. I replaced the curtains, repainted the porch, filled the rooms with light. Every Sunday, I held small meetings for seniors in the neighborhood, teaching them how to protect their finances, recognize manipulation, and stand up for themselves. Olivia began coming too. She didn't talk much at first, just listened. But then, one afternoon, she helped an older woman set up online banking safely. The woman hugged her, and Olivia smiled, the first real smile I'd seen on her face in a long time. After everyone left, she came to me and said softly, "Grandma, I want to work for the foundation someday." I looked at her, really looked at her, not as the girl who'd once laughed at my expense, but as the young woman who'd seen the darkness in her own home and chosen light instead. I said, You already are. One evening, I sat on the porch with Dr. Sterling. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. You really turned this around, he said quietly. Most people would have just wanted punishment. I smiled. I did, I admitted, at first, but revenge fades. Legacy doesn't. He nodded, and for a while, we just sat in silence, listening to the crickets sing. I pulled out the note, still folded, still creased, and handed it to him. I said, I think you should have this back. He looked at it, then shook his head. No, Martha, you keep it. You've earned the right to remember that you didn't run. So I did. I framed it and hung it by my front door, right above the light switch. A reminder that sometimes warnings aren't about fear. They're about awakening. A year later, the foundation hosted its first national conference. We had survivors, advocates, lawyers, and doctors all coming together because one old woman refused to stay silent. As I stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd, I saw faces full of hope. People ready to fight back, to protect others, to make sure what happened to me never happened again. I cleared my throat and said, people think aging makes you weak, but let me tell you something. When you've lived long enough, you stop being afraid of storms, because you've already survived worse. The audience rose in applause, and for the first time in years, I felt something pure. Not just victory, not just justice, but peace. Later that night, I stood alone outside the venue, looking at the stars. The air was cool, the kind that whispers through the leaves like old memories. I thought about Benjamin and Eleanor, paying their dues, rebuilding what they broke. I thought about Olivia, learning, changing, growing. And I thought about the doctor's note, the moment everything had begun. It had said, don't go home. But maybe, I had found my way home after all.